It began on a rain-slicked October morning, when the bells of St. Bartholomew's Hospital chimed 9. Inside the grand Victorian building, the air was sterile and tense. Nurses in crisp white uniforms whispered in corners, porters wheeled patients briskly past wards, and somewhere in the East Wing, a quiet horror had just unfolded. The surgery theatre, normally a domain of precision and calm, was now sealed off by Scotland Yard officers. It was from there, behind closed doors, that a man had vanished. Not just any man, but Dr. Percival Bramwell, the hospital's most renowned surgeon, who had entered the theatre at precisely 8:15 a.m. to perform a complex cardiac procedure, only to disappear without a trace before the operation even began. The patient still lay unconscious on the table, anesthesia humming steadily through the mask. The nurses who prepped the room swore the doctor had entered, scrubbed in, greeted them, and prepared his instruments. Then he was gone. The surgical team 5 in all each gave the same story. They turned to check the vitals, and when they turned back, Bramwell was no longer there. The operating room was sealed. No doors opened, no alarms triggered, not a single security camera caught his departure. It was as if the surgeon had dissolved into the air, scalpel and all. Lestrade stood by the operating table, his mustache twitching nervously. When Sherlock Holmes arrived, the detective stepped into the antiseptic chill of the theatre like a man entering a chapel, serious, silent, reverent. His sharp grey eyes swept the room, taking in the instruments, the sterile drapes, the bowed heads of the nurses, the heavy silence. "Well, Lestrade," Holmes said without preamble, "you summoned me to a locked room where a man has apparently dematerialized. Either St. Bartholomew's now dabbles in conjuring, or we're missing something very basic." Lestrade, looking more beleaguered than usual, gestured weakly at the surroundings. The man was here, Holmes. They all saw him. Then he wasn't. No footprints, no blood, no noise, no clue. HMM. Holmes knelt by the door, inspecting the edges of the heavy oak. "And the patient still under," said Lestrade. "We roused him briefly. No memory. He was sedated before the surgeon arrived." Holmes moved methodically. He circled the room twice, touched the hinges of the cabinets, peered beneath the gurney, examined the surgical tools, sniffed a damp towel, and finally stood by the wall-mounted sink, where he stared at a glistening droplet of water. He turned suddenly. "There's something wrong with the sequence," he said. Watson, who had followed Holmes in silence, raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "The witnesses say the surgeon entered at 8:15 and vanished before making his first incision. But no one noticed his departure. The room is sealed. The hallway camera confirms he entered, but not that he left." The scrub nurse, Miss Halberd. "Yes." A young woman stepped forward nervously. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. Describe precisely what happened." Miss Halberd swallowed. "He came in, scrubbed, checked the instruments, spoke briefly with the anesthetist, Dr. Chen. Then Dr. Chen said we were ready to begin. He turned to adjust the 4. We all turned. When we looked again, Dr. Bramwell was gone." Holmes nodded slowly. "And this was how long after his arrival?" "Less than 5 minutes." Holmes looked around the room again. Where's his surgical gown? His gloves? His mask? Still here, she said, pointing to the waste bin. He discarded them before vanishing. Holmes reached in with a pair of tongs and lifted the crumpled garments. He examined them closely. No tears, no stains, but slightly damp with sweat. Lestrade gave a frustrated sigh. What does it mean? Holmes didn't answer. He was staring at the ceiling vent now. Dr. Bramwell is a tall man. Lanky, agile. Yes, said Watson. A mountaineer in his youth. Holmes climbed onto the operating table and peered into the air vent, his lantern casting a narrow beam into the steel shaft. Too narrow for a grown man, he muttered. But the grill was unscrewed recently. Lestrade joined him. So, he escaped through the vents. No, Holmes said flatly. He didn't go through. Something came out. There was a beat of silence. Then Holmes jumped down and turned to the team. I want the hospital's maintenance logs. I want to know if anyone had access to the ventilation system in the last 24 hours. I also want to speak to whoever last cleaned this room. A nervous custodian was summoned. She was a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Vinton who had mopped the theatre at 6 a.m. Did you see anything unusual? Holmes asked. She hesitated. Well, there was a crate outside the door, marked surgical supplies, but no one signed it in. Holmes stiffened. And where is it now? Gone, sir. Wasn't there when I finished? Holmes's voice turned urgent. Get me the delivery logs. Now. Lestrade barked the order. Meanwhile, Holmes stepped into the hallway and motioned for Watson. This is no disappearance, he said softly. It's a substitution. Someone entered the room disguised as Dr. Bramwell. Used the momentary distraction to vanish into a crate wheeled out on a pretext. The real Bramwell may never have entered this room at all. Watson frowned, but everyone swore it was him. A tall man in surgical garb, face partially covered, moving with confidence it would suffice. The surgical mask is a perfect disguise. No one questioned his identity. The delivery logs were rushed in. One entry stood out. A crate signed, out by a porter named Marcus Treble at 8:22 a.m. 7 minutes after Bramwell was last seen. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Find Treble. Bring him here. But Treble was gone. Vanished. Holmes stared at the name on the clipboard, then at the empty hallway, and finally back into the shadowed theatre. The man who walked into this room was not Bramwell, he said. He was an imposter, and the real Bramwell either abducted or already dead. This was not a vanishing. It was an exchange. The mystery begins not in this room but in what lies beyond it. And with that, the great detective stepped out into the storm-swept streets of London, the first clue glinting like a scalpel in his mind. Rain whispered against the windows of St. Bartholomew's as Holmes stood unmoving in the corridor. Outside the operating theatre, he was still, yet intensely alive, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed, but mind racing. Watson, ever his faithful companion, observed the familiar posture and waited, knowing better than to interrupt the gears turning behind. That pale brow. Inside, Lestrade busied himself with questioning the surgical staff yet again. While constables scoured the immediate vicinity for any sign of the missing porter Marcus Dreeble, Holmes had already deduced that Dreeble, if such a man truly existed, was part of the illusion. A vanishing surgeon, an unscheduled crate, and a missing porter. No, this was no spontaneous disappearance. It was performance, calculated, rehearsed, precise. Holmes's eyes snapped open. "Watson," he said, "come with me." They descended a narrow flight of stairs to the hospital's subterranean leveler web of boiler rooms, storage areas, and laundry corridors seldom visited by anyone not in uniform. A janitor, startled by Holmes's sudden appearance, nearly dropped his mop. "Your pardon," Holmes said, brushing past. "We're looking for the delivery entrance." And a crate, possibly wooden, roughly 6 feet long. The janitor blinked, saw one like that wheeled out this morning, didn't recognize the bloke pushing it. Big fellow, moved quick. Did he go out through the main exit? The janitor shook his head. No, service alley behind the furnace. Corridor, shortcut. Holmes and Watson hurried through the dim corridor, the scent of bleach and hot water thick in the air. They reached the alley door, already ajar, and stepped out into the grey drizzle. There were no crates in sight, only the faint imprint of a wheel in a shallow puddle. Holmes knelt and traced the indentation with a fingertip. "Too deep," he murmured. The crate was heavier when it left than when it arrived. That confirms someone was inside. But where would they go? Asked Watson, glancing down the foggy alley. Not far, Holmes replied. Too risky. The escape required time, not distance. They needed the illusion to last long enough for confusion to spread. They circled to the far end of the alley, where a side gate hung loosely on its hinges. Beyond it lay a row of brownstone townhouses, repurposed into medical offices. Holmes's gaze landed on one with a brass plaque reading, Dr. Albert Eddington, consultant anesthetist. He paused. "Eddington," he said. That name didn't appear on the morning roster. They climbed the short steps and knocked. A few moments passed before the door opened to reveal a gaunt man in spectacles and a burgundy dressing gown. His eyes widened when he saw Holmes. "Oh," he stammered. "Yes, forgive the intrusion." Holmes said smoothly, "Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. May we come in?" I'm terribly busy." Holmes stepped forward. "A man has vanished, and we believe he may have passed through this alley. Your door faces the path. Might you have seen a porter wheeling a crate?" Dr. Eddington's face paled. No. I was with a patient this morning, an elderly lady. Rather delicate. I don't look out much." Watson caught the flicker of nervousness in his voice, the slight tremor in his hand as he clutched the dressing gown tighter. Holmes, meanwhile, let his eyes wander. He noticed a pair of surgical gloves lying by the hearth, still damp. A coat hung on a hook near the door, and from its pocket something gleamed faintly. Holmes gestured to the coat. "Bit of a stain." There Eddington turned sharply. "What? Oh, must be coffee." Holmes reached in and drew out a small silver disc, a hospital ID badge. It read, "Porter, Marcus Dreeble." Holmes turned it over in his palm, watching Eddington with cold intensity. "I assume coffee stains also appear in the shape of surgical antiseptic, he said dryly. Eddington's mouth worked silently before he said, "You don't understand." "No," Holmes interrupted. "You don't understand the weight of the game you've joined. You've lied twice in less than 2 minutes. You claimed you didn't know Marcus Treble, yet his identification is in your coat. You claimed you didn't see a crate wheeled past, yet the soil from the wheel marks matches the trail across your front step. And you're wearing a dressing gown over trousers that bear the creases of a man who's been on his feet all morning." Eddington slumped against the doorframe, face pale. "I didn't plan this," he whispered. I was told to help. That was all. They paid me, threatened me. Who are they?" But Eddington's lips clumped shut. Holmes stepped forward, face inches from the man's. "You think this is over a paycheck? A man is missing, possibly dead. This is no longer a matter of professional misconduct. This is conspiracy, abduction, and possibly murder." "I didn't hurt anyone," Eddington whispered. "I just opened the gate. That's all. They said they'd take care of the rest." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Then tell me what you do know." The man swallowed. "There was a woman, blonde, foreign accent, called herself Madame Kruger. She brought the plan. She said Bramwell had to disappear for a few hours. Said it was political, a trade or something. I didn't ask. I was told to collect the crate once it was out. Hide it in the old incinerator house on Lamb's Court. Was the surgeon inside? I don't know. I never opened it." Holmes turned on his heel. "You're coming with us." They marched. Eddington through the wet streets to Lamb's Court, an abandoned service yard now swallowed by fog. The incinerator house stood silent, its iron doors chained shut. Holmes motioned to Watson. Together, they forced the rusted lock. The door creaked open. Inside, the crate sat against the far wall. Watson approached first, breath tight. He undid the latches with trembling fingers. Inside was a folded hospital uniform, surgical mask, gloves, a bottle of chloroform. But no man. Eddington blanched. It was there. "I swear it was there this morning." Holmes stared into the empty crate. "Of course it was," he murmured. "And now it's gone. Removed while your back was turned." He rose slowly, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "This deception is deeper than I imagined," he said. "Madame Kruger, she's not just a name. She's the hand beneath the curtain. But what is she after?" Watson asked. Holmes looked once more at the empty crate. "I intend to find out." The fog clung to Holmes's coat as he emerged from the incinerator house, face grim. The crate, now nothing more than a shell of vanished evidence, had revealed its most disturbing truth, not what it contained, but what it no longer did. Somewhere between the theatre and this forsaken yard, the game had moved ahead without them. Watson glanced at Eddington, who sat on a crate outside, head in hands, shivering more from guilt than cold. "He's not the architect of this," Holmes said softly. "A pawn. And pawns rarely know which direction the board leans." Eddington looked up at them, voice hoarse. "I told you everything. I swear it." Holmes nodded absently. "Already." Pulling together threads in his mind. "Then you'll come to Scotland Yard and swear it again." They handed the man over to Lestrade, who arrived moments later, cursing under his breath about chasing shadows and crates. Holmes remained silent. As they returned to the hospital, the place now buzzed with rumors. Word had spread among the staff, and the operating wing was no longer just sealed, it was tense. Suspicious, charged with whispers. Back in the East Wing, Holmes called for the surgical team once more. The same 5 gathered in the theatre lounge: nurse Halberd, anesthetist Dr. Chen, surgical assistant Murphy, and 2 interns, Price and Little. They looked different now, not just fatigued, but wary. Holmes stood before them without ceremony. "You have all given statements to Inspector Lestrade. I'd like to hear them again, from each of you, here, now." They exchanged uneasy glances. Nurse Halberd spoke first. "As I said before, Dr. Bramwell entered at 8:15. I helped him into gloves. He greeted us as usual, asked Dr. Chen if the patient was sedated, and then he was gone. And you saw him discard his gloves and gown." "I didn't see it directly, but I noticed them in the bin afterward." Holmes's gaze shifted. "Dr. Chen, you spoke to him?" Chen nodded, folding his arms. "He asked if the patient was stable. I said yes. I turned to adjust the anesthesia flow. He was standing to my right, seconds later gone. And you didn't hear the door?" "No." "That's what baffles me." Holmes turned to the surgical assistant. "Murphy, a thin, intense man with darting eyes. You?" "I was adjusting the monitor. I saw the doctor moving behind me. Then, nothing." Holmes watched him carefully. "You seem unsure." Murphy cleared his throat. "It happened fast. We were focused. None of us thought to question it until he was missing." Now to the interns. Price, a young man with a serious expression, kept his voice even. "I was preparing the tray. I barely looked up. I assumed the procedure had been delayed." Little, pale and sweating, gave a nod. "Same here." Holmes moved slowly now, circling them like a predator in thought. "Curious," he said. "Each of you insists you saw Bramwell, but no one can swear to his actions beyond vague gestures. No one saw him make an incision, touch a tool, speak more than a word or two. 5 people, all medically trained, all conditioned to observe minute details, and not one of you noticed anything specific." There was a heavy silence. Holmes stopped by the bin again, lifting the discarded gloves and gown with the tongs. "Murphy, would you mind stepping forward?" Murphy blinked. "Me? Yes. You're of similar build to Bramwell. Try the gown." Murphy hesitated, then took the gown and slipped it on. It fit perfectly. Holmes tilted his head. Face covered, gloves on, posture correct. Anyone could have passed for Bramwell if they moved with purpose. He turned to the others. "Did anyone enter this theatre between 7:30 and 8:15? The staff looked at one another. Chen answered. "A porter brought a fresh tray of gauze. I think it was before 8. "Can you describe him?" "Tall, quiet, wore the standard white coat." Holmes nodded slowly. "No badge, no. But that's not unusual." Holmes made no comment, only observed the faces before him. Nurse Halberd, too eager; Murphy, too quiet; Little, Frightened, but of what? He turned to Liddle. You're sweating, he said gently. The others aren't. The intern flinched. I don't. Did you see something? Liddle looked at the others, then back at Holmes. It's probably nothing. Holmes stepped forward. Say it anyway. Liddle hesitated, then said in a breath, there was a moment before we began. Dr. Bramwell walked past me, and I smelled something strange. Like metal, not blood. Something chemical. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And did you mention this to the inspector? No. I thought, maybe it was cleaning solution. Holmes's fingers twitched at his sides. Thank you, Mr. Liddle. He turned and walked toward the anesthesia console. Kneeling beside it, Dr. Chen, he said without looking up, when you prepared the anesthetic, did you check the tank seal yourself? Yes, said Chen, frowning. Standard protocol. Did you test the feed line? Yes, of course. Holmes disconnected the line with a hiss. He examined the nozzle, sniffed, and then looked up. This line has trace vapor of ethylene glycol. Chen stared. That's not a hospital-grade sedative. No. But it can mimic anesthetic in small doses. It would explain the unusual scent Liddle noticed. Someone tampered with this feed briefly, enough to justify a distraction. While the staff was checking for inconsistencies in flow rate, the imposter vanished. Lestrade entered at that moment. We've got eyes on a carriage that left Lamb's. Caught half an hour ago. Driver swears it was a woman in black with something heavy under a sheet. Direction: toward the river. Holmes looked at the surgical team one last time. This deception was layered. Someone here lied, but the real architect is still ahead of us. He stepped away, coat swirling behind him. To the river, Lestrade, before the tide takes the truth with it. The fog over the Thames hung like gauze, dampening sound and lending the riverbanks a spectral hush. Holmes and Lestrade stood on the stone quay near Wapping Old Stairs, the constable's lantern casting a dim halo over the wet cobbles. A riverman confirmed what Lestrade had feared. Yes, a hansom cab had stopped here earlier. A woman in black, veiled, speaking German-accented English, had handed off a rolled carpet to a waiting launch and then disappeared into the mist. No name. No distinguishing feature, just a faint perfume, sharp and floral lilac and something medicinal beneath. She was calm. The rivermen had said, paid double fare and said nothing else. Holmes stood still, his eyes not on the water, but on the outline of boot prints left in the silt beside the dock. One set heavy, dragging the carpet, the other light, quick. She didn't panic. Holmes murmured, because she didn't need to. This was never a desperate escape, it was a transfer. A carefully timed handoff. Whatever or whoever was in that crate is now on the river, heading somewhere prepared in advance. Lestrade exhaled. So we're back at the beginning. Still no clue who's behind this. Holmes gave him a sidelong glance. On the contrary, we know precisely what this is. It's a deception constructed not round a disappearance, but a substitution. Bramwell vanished, yes, but his absence was engineered by someone who had access to the theatre, knew the protocols, and could manipulate them without setting off alarms. Lestrade scratched his temple. But who'd go through all that trouble? Someone with motive. Holmes said, and motive is always the compass. They returned to Baker Street by midday. A short rest, a black coffee, and Holmes was back in motion notes sprawled across the desk. Red thread crisscrossing maps and timetables on the wall. Watson watched as he muttered aloud, sorting names and faces like a man arranging a chessboard mid-match. "Let's list them," Holmes said sharply. Each person involved directly with the operating theatre on the morning Bramwell vanished, and what they stood to gain. He moved to the chalkboard. Nurse Halberd, old acquaintance of Bramwell. They trained together. She stayed in London. He moved to Berlin for a year. Rumour suggests there was more than friendship, but no one could confirm. When Bramwell returned, he distanced himself. Revenge? Watson asked. Possibly, Holmes murmured. But would she orchestrate something this elaborate? Perhaps, perhaps not. He marked her name in yellow. Next Murphy, surgical assistant, competent, but undistinguished. Bramwell passed him over last month for a research grant position. Jealousy? Certainly, he'd been told it was his time. Instead, Bramwell gave it to a young intern Price. Holmes underlined both names. And yet, Price has no known enemies. What he does have is a father under indictment for medical fraud, a matter Bramwell was set to testify in next month. Watson sat forward. So Price has motive fear. Holmes nodded once. More than that, desperation. If Bramwell testified, Price's father would face public ruin. But removing Bramwell entirely delays the proceedings indefinitely, perhaps permanently. He added Little's name in grey. No known motive. But he's anxious, hiding something. Maybe he's just rattled. Holmes frowned. He saw more than he admits. Of that I'm sure. And Dr. Chen? Watson asked. Holmes looked thoughtful. No direct motive. But to come. When an anesthetic line is tampered with, any conscientious anesthetist would be in panic. He seemed insulated, as though he knew nothing truly dangerous had occurred. And what of Eddington? Afraid, genuinely afraid. Someone used him, but he was never meant to see the full picture. Holmes returned to his desk and lifted the porter's badge marker Strebel. He studied it again under the glass, then froze. Watson noticed. What is it? Holmes stood abruptly. This badge was forged. He turned it toward Watson. Look closely at the stamp along the rim. It reads St. Bartholomew's. An H instead of an A. A counterfeit, meant to pass inspection only at a glance. Watson exhaled. So Strebel never existed. No, Holmes said. But someone wore this name long enough to move freely through the hospital. Someone trusted, someone known. To the staff, he paced again, the web tightening. What's the common thread? He muttered. Revenge, fear, ambition. But who profits? A knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a tray. Inspector Lestrade's returned. Mr. Holmes, he says here's something urgent. Lestrade entered seconds later, flushed from the street. We found something at Eddington's flat, hidden beneath the floorboards. It's odd. He placed a leather portfolio on Holmes's desk. Inside were letters, German handwriting. coded phrases, a seal belonging to the German Imperial Medical Society. Watson frowned. What the devil is this? Bramwell, Holmes murmured. Of course, he was in Berlin for a year, and he wasn't just attending lectures, he was observing medical experiments, political ones. He leafed through the papers, an exchange program funded by the Reich's medical ministry, highly classified. If Bramwell was smuggled out, it wasn't just a disappearance. It was an extraction. Watson paled. So this wasn't a crime, it was espionage. Holmes's voice dropped. Or both. Someone in that theatre knew he was due to testify in England. Someone who feared the ramifications, either political or personal. A plot was arranged to spirit him away before he could speak. He paused, and Madame Kruger, Lestrade, looked up. Who? Holmes stepped to the wall and pointed to a photograph clipped beneath a newspaper heading. Medical Symposium, Zurich 1891. Bramwell stood smiling among colleagues. Next to him, a striking woman with sharp eyes. Helena Kruger, Holmes said. Former East Prussian intelligence. Now posing as a surgical liaison for the European Medical Bureau. Watson's brow furrowed. So Bramwell was the target of his own side or defected willingly? That, Holmes said, is the question. That remains. He stared at the photo. This web leads far deeper than we imagined, Watson. But it begins and ends with the truth about Bramwell. Whether he vanished against his will or as part of a bargain, yet to be revealed. And somewhere out there, downriver and drifting toward foreign shores, that truth was moving swiftly away. It was 2 days later when Lestrade burst into Baker Street, flushed with triumph and clumsily triumphant. He held aloft a telegram in one hand and a tattered overcoat in the other, the latter sealed in a clear oilskin bag, its collar stained dark and stiff. We've got him, he declared. Your missing surgeon, Dr. Bramwell, was found at Low, tied near Tilbury, dead, strangled, weighted down with iron splints from the hospital's own supply closet. The case is closed. Holmes didn't rise from his armchair. He merely regarded Lestrade as one might study a chessboard that had just yielded an unexpected, though not decisive move. Body identified, he asked, voice level, positively. Clothing matches. The coat was monogrammed, a wallet with his identification inside. Hospital badge included. Face unrecognizable, Lestrade admitted, slightly deflated. The river had done its work, but the wallet, coat, and badge are enough for the coroner. Scotland Yard's putting out a statement within the hour. Watson, who had risen from the fireplace, glanced at Holmes. That seems awfully fast. It does, Holmes replied, and yet not surprising. Lestrade frowned. What do you mean? Holmes tapped his fingertips together. You recall the badge recovered at the theatre, a forgery. Too crude to pass scrutiny, but sufficient to fool in the moment. What? If this wallet, this coat, these items were curated the same way, chosen for effect, not for identity? Lestrade looked exasperated. So you're saying this isn't Bramwell? I'm saying, Holmes said carefully, that someone wanted you to believe it was. He stood and approached the coat Lestrade had brought, carefully, with gloves. He examined the stitching, then flipped the collar. He smiled faintly. "Observe here," he said, holding up the underside of the monogram. "The thread used is white cotton, subtle, but Bramwell's valet was a German man named Joseph, fastidious and always used linen floss. This isn't his handiwork." Watson tilted his head. "Then someone stitched this after the fact." "Precisely. A planted garment, worn by a corpse whose identity was meant to mimic Bramwell. A man of similar build, similar facial structure perhaps, even someone terminal or already deceased dressed, and drowned to create a false conclusion." Lestrade opened his mouth, then closed it again. "And the badge?" Holmes smiled wryly. "I'd wager it's a copy of Bramwell's real one, or at least a convincing facsimile. But I doubt the numbers will match his personnel file precisely. I suspect, once inspected, you'll find a slight misalignment in the engraving." He stepped back. "They've thrown you a bone, Lestrade. One designed to stop the chase before it gets too close to whatever they're truly hiding." Lestrade's confidence drained with each word. "So what now?" "Now," Holmes said, "we dig deeper. Because this pantomime of closure has confirmed what I suspected. Bramwell was extracted, not murdered, but someone wants it believed he's dead, which means he's alive and valuable." Watson sat slowly. "But to whom? The Germans, the British, or someone else entirely?" Holmes walked to the window. The sky was grey again, rain threatening. "Let's examine what we know. Bramwell was poised to testify in a fraud case implicating powerful figures. At the same time, he carried knowledge from his time in Berlin, knowledge, perhaps valuable to foreign interests. Either made him a target. Both made him dangerous." He turned. "If he was abducted, it required precision. If he defected, it required planning. In either case, someone within the hospital facilitated it." Watson nodded. "The operating room staff." "Exactly. But who?" Halberd with her veiled resentment. "Murphy and his bruised ambition, Chen's unnatural calm, or Price, trying to protect his father." He moved back to the board, eyes darting from name to name. "There's a pattern, and whoever faked this corpse wants us to abandon it just as it begins to cohere." The following morning brought an anonymous letter to Baker Street. Thick vellum, no return address, no watermark. Holmes opened it at the breakfast table. One sentence, clipped from various newspapers and glued together like a ransom note. "You're getting close. Stop now, or the next body will be real." Holmes read it aloud. Watson paled. Lestrade, summoned moments later, stared in disbelief. "It's a threat," he said. "It's a warning," Holmes corrected. "And it confirms two things. First, they're watching us. Second, they're worried, which means we are very much on the right track." He examined the envelope again. No fingerprints. Scented faintly of lavender, the same floral lilac perfume the rivermen described. He looked at Lestrade. "Tell me, did you examine the crate Eddington loaded? Did anyone weigh it before it was burned?" Lestrade hesitated. "No. We were focused on the crate, not the weight. Then we don't know if it contained a living man, a corpse, or merely debris. Meaning the launch from the docks may have held only theatre, while the real transfer of Bramwell happened elsewhere. Or earlier. Watson shook his head. So even the river escape was a decoy. Holmes looked grim. It would be poetic, wouldn't it? A man who vanishes from a sealed room, whose fake corpse washes ashore, and whose truth lies in shadows thick with motive and fear. He crossed the room, lifted the intern's personnel file. Little, he said quietly. He was jumpy, observant, but never once mentioned knowing Bramwell outside the theatre. And yet, he opened the file. Here, a summer internship at Heidelberg. Same months Bramwell was in Berlin. He tapped it. They met before, perhaps knew each other well. So, why lie? Holmes closed the file. Because he's the weak link. And if I press, he'll crack. Outside, the rain began at last, thin and sharp against the windows. Holmes stood, already reaching for his coat. Come, Watson, the yard celebrates a false victory, but the real war has just begun. It was nearly dusk when Holmes and I reached the modest lodging house tucked behind Fitzroy Square, where Edward Liddell had taken up temporary residence during his internship. The evening had brought a low fog that clung to the lamplights like gauze, and Holmes seemed, if anything, further sharpened by the damp air, his step precise, his gaze taut with calculation. Liddell answered the door himself. He looked surprised, but not alarmed until Holmes took a single step inside without invitation, and closed the door firmly behind him. "We won't take much of your time, Mr. Liddell," Holmes said, his voice smooth but glacial. "Just a few questions about Berlin and Dr. Bramwell." The young man's face tightened, a flicker of calculation behind his eyes. "I told the Yard everything. You told them nothing," Holmes cut in, "except a rehearsed account. Of the day of the surgery. You said you didn't know Bramwell before this rotation, but you spent 8 weeks in Heidelberg 2 years ago. Did you not?" Yes. But I never met him there." Holmes's voice turned slightly. "No. Strange, then, that Bramwell gave a guest lecture at your hospital the same summer. There are even records of a small dinner afterward, and photographs." Little's mask slipped for the briefest second. Guilt, not fear. "He asked us to keep quiet," Little murmured. "He said it was safer if no one linked us." Holmes leaned in slightly. "Who was us?" Little hesitated. "There were 3 of us. Myself, another student named Clara Weiss now in Zurich, and Bramwell. We worked on a paper together. He was experimenting with a technique for cranial pressure relief. It was theoretical, not sanctioned. There were ethics issues. I think the university wanted it buried." Holmes's expression grew unreadable. "And did anyone die?" Little's silence was answer enough. "An accident," he whispered. "One of the subjects, he wasn't supposed to be part of it. A porter. He volunteered for a demonstration after hours. Something went wrong. Bramwell took the blame. He was dismissed quietly. No charges. We were told to forget it, clearly." Holmes said, "You haven't." Watson and I exchanged glances. The deeper we dug, the further the tale reached backward. This wasn't simply about fraud or abduction. It was about a buried history coming back to surface with lethal intent. Little sat down slowly. "I thought someone found out. That's why he vanished. That maybe someone came from Berlin." Holmes studied him, then asked, "Did Bramwell ever mention anyone named Halbert during those Heidelberg days?" Liddell blinked. "No, but there was a visiting Professor Dr. Gerhardt. Very sharp, cold, wore gloves all the time. Even in summer, he seemed to have some sway over Bramwell. They'd argue, often." Holmes was motionless for a full second. Then he turned to Watson and me. "Gerhardt," he said quietly, "not a common name. And I suspect we've heard it under another." From here in London, the realization clicked into place as quickly for me as for Holmes. "Halbert," I said. "It's an anglicized version. Precisely. She's no ordinary theatre nurse. She's a surgeon in disguise, hiding in plain sight. But why hide?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "Because if the public knew that Dr. Maria Halbert was once Gerhardt, a disgraced surgeon, involved in covert experiments, they'd never let her within a mile of a scalpel." We returned to Baker Street with a different urgency. As Holmes sifted through his files, he unearthed an old clipping from the Berliner Tageblatt. A woman, Dr. Maria Gerhardt, had been implicated in a secretive medical trial that ended in scandal. The case had been quietly dismissed, details suppressed, but the photograph was unmistakable. Watson frowned. "And now she's changed her name, taken up a role beneath her talents, and inserted herself into Bramwell's world again. To finish what she started, or to bury it completely," Holmes said. "But either way, she's not working alone." He pointed to a record from the Royal Medical Society. Halbert had received a recommendation from a Dr. Frederick Chen 5 years ago at the time. A minor surgical fellow. Their paths had crossed before. And Chen, Holmes said softly, has been suspiciously neutral throughout. Calm, unreadable. A man used to pressure. It was nearing midnight when Lestrade arrived again. Breathless and clutching a bundle of documents Holmes had requested earlier. Among them was an incident report from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, a medical malpractice case from 10 years prior, sealed and buried. A patient had died during an experimental procedure. The lead surgeon, a Dr. Nicholas Price. Holmes's expression didn't change, but something settled behind his eyes. "And there it is," he said. "What is?" I asked. "A convergence. 3 physicians, Halbert, Chen, and Price, each connected by old, buried transgressions, each facing ruin at different points in time, and each now present in Bramwell's final operation." He laid out their connections on the table like threads on a loom. All had motive, all had secrets to keep, but only one would have had the precision to fake a death, forge a false trail, and eliminate a witness. He pointed at Halbert's name. She was never assisting Bramwell. She was managing him, guiding him toward his vanishing point. She forged the badge. She led the misdirection. But Chen and Price, if their complicities because they owed her, or feared exposure. Watson looked grim. And the body in the river. A man already dead, perhaps terminal, requisitioned, as it were, to play a final role. Likely from the hospital's hospice wing, an unclaimed soul. We sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of it all settling in. Then Holmes spoke, low and firm. "The crime wasn't born last week in an operating room. It was conceived a decade ago. In failed experiments and buried guilt, this what we've witnessed is the harvest of old sins. He straightened. Tomorrow we speak with Halberd, but not in the theatre. She'll expect that. Watson raised a brow. Where then? Holmes smiled faintly. At the archive, where the past has a voice, and where, I suspect, hers will betray her. The following morning found Holmes standing by the soot-streaked windows of the hospital's records annex, his lean frame composed, hands clasped behind his back. The place was quiet. Dimly lit rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls, and the scent of dust and antiseptic hung in the air. It was here, among the silent history of operations past, that Holmes had arranged the next move. Nurse Halberd arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, as summoned by an innocuous note from the hospital's deputy administrator. Penned by Holmes's own hand, she entered briskly, her expression taut but not anxious. She wore her usual immaculate uniform, and her hands, always gloved, clutched a folded notebook. Holmes gestured toward a chair across from the metal desk. Miss Halberd, thank you for coming. I've asked you here because we've uncovered certain irregularities in the hospital's operating records. You were, I believe, present during Dr. Bramwell's final procedure? I was assisting. Yes, she replied calmly. I've already provided my account to the Yard. Indeed. And I ask only one indulgence, Holmes said, producing from his coat pocket a small black velvet pouch. He opened it to reveal a metal object, an intricate, antique surgeon's clasp. Would you mind identifying this? She blinked once. It's a theatre instrument clip, Victorian, by the look of it. Not just any clip, Holmes said gently. This belonged to Dr. Armand Holt, one of the pioneers of cerebral trepanation. It was his personal surgical clasp, a gift passed down to Bramwell by his mentor in Heidelberg. Quite irreplaceable. You see, it went missing the day of the operation, or that such a treasured piece would vanish. She frowned but said nothing. Holmes smiled faintly and tucked the clasp back into the pouch. You didn't expect it to resurface, did you? A pause. Then, are you suggesting I took it? I suggest nothing, he said. But let me show you something curious. He walked to the far end of the annex, where a chart had been pinned to a corkboard. Across it were names, dates, and procedures, most notably one line near the bottom. Written in red ink, read, Specimen 47, donor identification pending. Holmes tapped it lightly. This entry appeared the morning after Bramwell's disappearance, and oddly, the only name not logged into the post-op refrigeration chamber that night was yours. Miss Halberd. She gave no outward reaction, but her right hand twitched, a subtle, involuntary motion Holmes tracked immediately. I didn't go near that room, she said evenly. Security logs can confirm it. Security logs, Holmes echoed. Yes, but those are easily doctored, particularly by someone with access to the administrator's office. He stepped closer, gaze narrowing. The thing is, Miss Halberd, I don't believe you're entirely heartless. I believe that in your own twisted way, you saw this vanishing act as a salvation for Bramwell, for yourself, and perhaps for the others caught in the web of your past. But I wonder how far does that salvation extend? Would you kill for it? Still no answer. Holmes turned to Watson, who had been quietly setting up a small chemical station near the desk. He now lifted a vial and a strip of gauze soaked in a greenish solution. Now, Holmes said, I'll require only a few minutes of your time. We're going to conduct a simple test. What kind of test? Halbert asked. A variation of the Kasselmeyer test, used typically to detect traces of hemoglobin, but with a slight adaptation from Dr. Corrigan's work in Vienna. It becomes sensitive to certain surgical sterilants, particularly those used only on cadavers. He stepped forward, holding out the gauze. Your gloves, if you please. There was a beat of stillness. Then, with no change of expression, she peeled the gloves from her hands and handed them over. Watson applied the reagent slowly. At first, nothing. But then a faint violet tinge bloomed on the fingertips. Holmes gave a soft, satisfied nod. You handled a preserved cadaver some time after the operation, didn't you? But not in the mortuary. Somewhere private, somewhere quiet, likely with help. Because while you are a skilled surgeon, you are not large enough to carry a body unaided. I had no choice, she said suddenly, her voice cracked slightly human. At last, they were going to expose us all. Bramwell panicked. He wanted to vanish. But he was also afraid to go alone. So you staged it, Holmes murmured. The river corpse, the theatre misdirection, and Price, Chen. They helped you. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Price owed me everything. His career only continued because I buried the records that would have destroyed him. And Chen, he was too afraid to defy me. They were all afraid. And the real Bramwell? Alive, she said. For now. Holmes's expression darkened. Where? She looked away. Holmes turned swiftly and opened one of the drawers behind her. Inside were records, but not from St. Ignatius. From a private clinic in Wapping. One recently shuttered, supposedly under renovation. It had been registered under the name M. Hartley, an anagram of Halbert term, a name Holmes had deciphered hours earlier and cross-checked against city leases. You moved him there, Holmes said. A private ward. Off the books. But why? She hesitated. He wanted to make a statement, a public revelation, about what we did in Heidelberg. He wanted to purge himself, but he wouldn't survive it. His career, his life, it would all be over. So we made him disappear. A new identity, new life. I handled the rest. You mean the corpse, the forgeries, the river, Holmes said, and you expected no one would probe too deeply. He didn't die, she said. I saved him, but you killed a man. To make the illusion complete, her silence was confirmation enough. Lestrade stepped in then. Having waited in the hallway for the signal, Halbert didn't protest as he read the charge. She simply stood, proud and broken, and allowed herself to be led away. Holmes remained still for several moments after she was gone. Then he turned to Watson. She is no madwoman, he said softly. Just someone who tried to rewrite the past and failed. The clue was never in her words, but in her silence, in the way she flinched from the mention of ethics, but never From deceit, Watson said, and Bramwell. We find him, Holmes said, tonight, before this vanishing act becomes permanent. The rain had thickened by nightfall, drumming steadily against the iron-framed windows of 221B Baker Street. Holmes stood by the hearth, the faint glow of the fire licking at his profile. On the table lay a dossier, copies of patient logs, a floor plan of the shuttered Wapping Clinic, and the initial testimony Halbert had offered before being taken into custody. It was all beginning to converge into a shape Holmes could nearly define. Nearly. Watson entered with a telegram in hand, face grim. It's from Lestrade. The clinic was broken into. Everything's been cleared out, records, equipment, bedding. Even the ventilation ducts were scrubbed clean. No sign of Bramwell. Holmes took the slip and read it twice, jaw tightening. They moved him, he muttered, and quickly. Someone knew we were closing in. Watson glanced at the fireplace, where a faint wisp of smoke curled upward. It couldn't have been Halbert. She's under lock and key. Indeed, Holmes said, tapping the telegram thoughtfully, which means she wasn't acting alone even now. Someone else has taken control. Holmes turned to the dossier. The property in Wapping had been leased under Halbert's alias, but someone else had to have financed it. Its location, the secrecy, and the outfitting required for post-operative recovery suggested considerable resources. Bramwell wasn't simply being hidden, he was being protected or silenced. He sifted through the floor plan again, then paused. One of the duplicate pages, the list of medical suppliers servicing the Wapping location, was gone. Watson, he said softly, did you remove anything from this file? Not a word, Watson replied. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then, we've been visited. He stepped to the door, checked the lock intact. Yet on the floor near the threshold, he picked up a faint thread of dark cloth caught beneath the corner of the rug. He held it up to the light. Not wool, not cotton. Surgical gauze dyed black. We have a shadow, Holmes said. Someone has been one step ahead of us since Halbert's arrest. This thread wasn't here this morning. Someone stole the supplier list, Watson asked. Yes, likely to delay us. The list contained names of distributors, surgical beds, portable ventilators, specific pharmaceuticals for cranial trauma, all traceable. Holmes's expression was hardening. They've severed the trail. A knock came at the door. Lestrade stepped in, rain on his coat. I came straight from Wapping. The clinic's been emptied out down to the nails. Even the incinerator was scrubbed. Holmes gave him a cold nod. Then our adversary is thorough, but not perfect. Tell me, were the ash bins removed? Lestrade blinked. No. Why? Because fire always leaves a whisper. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. An hour later, they stood in the skeletal remains of the clinic. The faint scent of bleach and charred wood hung in the air. Holmes knelt by the brick incinerator at the rear, its hatch creaking on rusted hinges. Inside, charred fragments of paper and metal had escaped full combustion. He used tweezers to extract a sliver of scorched parchment, held it to the lantern's light. There, half-burnt, was a recognizable watermark. Montrose Surgical Registry, Zurich. Another read, patient. Be well. Post-op monitoring to be conducted every. The rest had been lost to the flames. Someone wanted these gone, Watson murmured. Completely. Holmes didn't answer. His mind had already moved to steps forward. Who had access to Zurich medical facilities and to UK transport networks? Someone who knew not only Bramwell's past, but had reason to protect it at all costs. Halbert might have orchestrated the stage play, but the puppet strings went higher. I need the supplier registry from Montrose, Holmes said sharply, and I need a named someone who can erase a man across borders and reassemble him in a new shell. Lestrade looked uncertain. We've no jurisdiction in Zurich. Holmes turned. Then get me someone who does. By dawn, another telegram arrived. It bore a cipher Holmes had used once in Vienna, years ago. It was from an old contact, a former intelligence officer with ties to European medical fronts. Name, Lucien Foch. British-born, former surgeon, current owner of Blackhurst Pharmaceuticals. Suspected in black market reconstructive surgeries and identity forging. Ties to Bramwell confirmed. Watson read the note aloud. We have our shadow. Holmes nodded, eyes gleaming cold. Foch always moved behind the curtain. He uses medicine not as healing, but as disguise. He will not risk exposure. A sharp knock interrupted them. Mrs. Hudson appeared, flustered. This just arrived by post. No return address. Holmes took the envelope. Inside was a single sheet. You're playing a dangerous game, Holmes. Turn back, or Bramwell vanishes. Forever. No signature. No fingerprints. Watson stepped forward, voice tight. He knows we're close. Holmes folded the paper carefully, then placed it atop the scorched Montrose parchment. The contrast was stark fire and threat, desperation and control. Somewhere between them lay the truth. We've lost the evidence, Holmes said, but we've gained clarity. This is no longer concealment, it's a final erasure. The closer we come, the more they dismantle the path. Then what do we do now? Watson asked. Holmes stepped to the window, watching as the city stirred beneath grey skies. We turn their silence into sound, he said. We make enough noise that Bramwell becomes too loud to disappear. And then we force the shadow to step into the light. The letter lay silent on the table, its warning etched in sharp, unyielding script. Holmes studied it without touching it further, his eyes narrowing. Foch has shifted from shadows to threats. That is desperation cloaked in bravado. He spoke the words almost to himself, but Watson felt the underlying tension begin to coil like wire. It was mid-morning when Inspector Lestrade returned, his face pale and lips pressed thin. Holmes looked up sharply as he stepped in. There's been another incident, Lestrade said grimly, at St. Margaret's Hospital. Holmes didn't wait for elaboration. Bramwell, no, Lestrade said. But you'll want to see this yourself. Within the hour, they stood outside the hospital's east wing, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and tension. A crowd had gathered, staff murmuring. Journalists kept at bay by constables. Inside, in a small recovery room still reeking faintly of ether, the body of Dr. Claude Wendley lay crumpled beside his surgical cart. His face was pale, the pupils pinpricks. An empty syringe lay just out of reach. Cyanide, The attending nurse whispered, or so the pathologist thinks. No sign of struggle. We think he injected himself, or someone made it look that way, Holmes murmured, crouching beside the body. Wenley's left sleeve was rolled up unevenly, but his dominant hand, his right, was completely untouched. A left-handed injection, Holmes said aloud. But Wenley was right-handed, was he not? The nurse nodded. Holmes rose slowly. Murder, not suicide. Lestrade looked stricken. Wenley was one of our informants. He helped us match the ventilation equipment order to that clinic in Wapping. Then, Fogg knew, Holmes said, and silenced him before he could offer more. The evidence isn't just vanishing, it's being erased one witness at a time. As the scene was secured, Holmes remained still for a moment longer, eyes tracing the floor, the bed, the wall. Then he abruptly crossed to the corner waste bin and withdrew a torn scrap of gauze, faintly stained at the edge. He held it up. Same black-dyed gauze as before. He said, Fogg or someone in his employ was here. Outside the hospital, rain began to fall again. The world felt grayer, smaller. They walked in silence until Baker Street, where Holmes moved directly to his desk and began rifling through the file on Fogg. He's removing all those who connect the trail from Halberd to Bramwell, he muttered. But why kill Wenley now unless the next piece of the puzzle is already in play? Watson watched as Holmes jotted out a rough timeline, aligning each event: the operating room vanishing, the Wapping clinic, the stolen supplier, registry, Wenley's murder. Each move is paired, Holmes said suddenly. Every step we've taken has a mirrored counter-move. Observation and disappearance. Interrogation and silence. Evidence and destruction. Watson leaned forward. Then what comes next? Holmes tapped the name at the bottom of the list. Beatrice Halberd. Fogg will come for her. She's the last direct link. Holmes sent Lestrade a telegram at once. Maximum security detail for Halberd. Immediate transfer to private holding under CID supervision. Notify only trusted personnel. No internal memos. But it was already too late. By the time Lestrade wired back, Halberd had been transferred supposedly on orders from Surmise for medical re-evaluation. Only no such order had ever been issued. She was gone. Holmes's face was a mask of iron as he read the message. Fogg isn't just ahead, he said softly. He's embedded. They now faced an adversary not simply maneuvering in the dark, but weaving into the very fabric of their operations. Every advance the detective made was anticipated. Every precaution counted. Watson clenched his fists. What now? How do we catch a man who seems to rewrite the rules as he goes? Holmes was already at the fireplace, retrieving the letter again. We make him break them. His fingers traced the edge of the paper. This note, its ink is industrial, faintly violet, used in telegraphic transfer receipts, very specific. There are only 3 firms in London that use it. Hours later, Holmes stood at the back entrance of one such firm, Marston and Vale Telegram Courier. After a short conversation and several coins discreetly passed to a night clerk, Holmes held a registry log in his hands. There, he said, pointing, delivered by hand 2 nights ago. The name used, Lucian Rookwood. Watson blinked. An alias? Holmes gave a tight nod. Used once before in the Vienna Clinic massacre. Fox old cover. He's getting sloppy. Holmes turned. To Watson, voice low but urgent. Get word to Lestrade. We need to find where Fox operating from. Somewhere off-grid. Close enough to move in and out of the city. Likely with medical-grade power, privacy, and a secure transport route. Before Watson could respond, a crash echoed outside, followed by a shout. Both men bolted to the window down below. Their carriage driver had been attacked. A shadowy figure darted into the alley, and Holmes didn't hesitate. He leapt down the stairwell and gave chase through the rain-soaked maze of cobbled lanes. Watson not far behind. They caught a glimpse of the figure turning a corner, tall, lean, dressed in a dark coat soaked to the hem. As Holmes rounded the bend, he found nothing, just an empty street, silent but for the rain. A manhole cover lay slightly ajar. Holmes paused only a moment, then stooped and opened it fully. The fetid smell of damp tunnels rose to meet him. He turned to Watson. He's under our feet now. But Watson stared back, pale. Holmes, your arm. Holmes followed his gaze. His sleeve was torn, and beneath it, a thin crimson welt was rising fast. On the edge of the frayed fabric, a glint of metal, a sliver of a needle, embedded. Watson moved forward at once. You've been dosed. Holmes gritted his teeth. Curare, light dose, paralytic. Watson tore off his scarf, tightening it above Holmes's elbow. We need to get you to a hospital. Holmes shook his head. No time. If Fox was here, he'll move Bramwell again. He's covering his escape. We must find him before the trail vanishes for good. The poison crept higher. Holmes's breath slowed. His words clipped but sharp. He's escalating. That was meant for the kill. We're too close. Watson tightened the band further. You can't chase shadows like this. Holmes met his gaze, steady despite the pain. I'm not chasing. I'm cornering. And he knows it. The game had shifted. The hunter had become the target. But even poisoned and faltering, Sherlock Holmes saw what others missed, and the final move was drawing near. Watson held Holmes's weight over his shoulder, navigating the slick alleyways back to Baker Street with a pace both urgent and deliberate. Holmes's breath came thinly, but he remained conscious. His grip around Watson's coat stiff and determined. Each step, each heartbeat seemed to stretch the moments longer. Yet his eyes were alert, calculating, even as the toxin wrestled with his nerves. Inside their flat, Watson lowered him gently into the armchair. Keep still, he ordered, tearing open his bag and drawing a hypodermic. Atropine, he muttered. It should counteract the effects. Holmes merely nodded, jaw clenched. As the injection entered his arm, he whispered, "We were wrong about the motive." Watson blinked. "What?" Holmes exhaled, slower now. "This isn't just about silencing loose ends. It's choreography. Fox orchestrating a narrative. He wants to be seen, just enough. The syringe was meant to scare, not kill. It's theater." Watson stood back, stunned. Why put himself at risk? To control the story, Holmes said. Each murder, each misdirection there's rhythm in the timing. He doesn't improvise. He calculates. He went still for a moment, then reached slowly toward the table, dragging the letter back into view. His eyes moved across it with new focus. "There's something here," he murmured. "This paper. The faint water stain on the corner. It's not moisture from rain." He angled it toward the light. "Sodium acetate, a compound used to preserve biological tissue." Watson's eyes widened. "From a surgical lab, not just any," Holmes whispered. "One that refrigerates cadavers." The room was quiet save for the clock on the mantel ticking with unnatural loudness. Holmes turned back to his notes, his fingers shaking slightly but eyes burning with clarity. Fogg has been staging from a cold facility hidden, likely abandoned. He needed electricity, medical equipment, and isolation. Holmes drew a circle over a map of London and tapped it. "There's one place that fits. Eastmoor Asylum. Closed 3 years ago after the scandal. Still owned by a private trust, never sold. Never reclaimed. And it has its own generator." Watson's voice was low. "You think Bramwell's there?" Holmes didn't answer directly. "I think Fogg never left. He's been working from Eastmoor since the beginning." He stood shakily, Watson supporting him. "We must move quickly. Fogg's trail won't stay warm forever." With Lestrade summoned and armed officers deployed, they arrived at Eastmoor near dusk. The place loomed like a rotting husk, its Gothic arches casting long, grotesque shadows. The wind wailed through cracked windows like the ghosts of the damned. Holmes stepped forward, his silhouette long and thin, face unreadable. They entered, through the rear, Holmes guiding them straight to the lower level without hesitation. A rusted freight lift stood open like a mouth. He pointed to the stairs instead. "I heard the gears," Holmes said. "The lift's been used recently." They descended in silence, pistols drawn. At the base of the stairwell, a corridor stretched into the dark, lit sporadically by flickering bulbs. It smelled of ammonia, formaldehyde, and faint decay. At the third door, Holmes paused. "Listen." Inside, soft humming. They burst through. What they saw made Lestrade flinch. It was a surgical theater, but warped. An operating table lay in the center, surrounded by aged machinery, some modern, some grotesquely retrofitted, for bags hung like decorations. On the far wall, a chalkboard bore notes written in looping, meticulous script, and there, unconscious but alive, was Dr. Gideon Bramwell. Tubes ran from his arms. Monitors beeped softly. On a nearby table, a sheaf of notes lay open. Holmes strode to them, flipping through. "These aren't medical," he said. "They're psychological profiles of every suspect, every witness. He's catalogued them, used them." Watson moved to Bramwell, checking his vitals. Stable, drugged, but unharmed. Then Holmes froze. There, tucked beneath the final page, was a photograph. It was of a woman, young, pale, eyes hollow, lips parted in a scream forever. "Silenced, Jane Halberd," Holmes whispered. "But this is from years ago." Watson stepped beside him. "You recognize it?" Holmes nodded. "It was submitted during the inquest into the Eastmoor deaths. This was the first case for tampered with." Suddenly, the pattern was clear. Of course, Holmes murmured, voice gaining strength. The whopping clinic. The altered schedules. The missing logs, they weren't disparate crimes. They were reconstructions. He stepped back from the photograph, pointing to the board. He's been recreating the failure that broke him. Eastmore was his fall. Jane Halberd died on his table under disputed circumstances. Bramwell blamed him. The scandal cost him his license. He vanished. Watson swallowed. So all this every victim. Holmes nodded grimly. Replacements. Surrogates. Actors in a drama Foch rewrote to redeem himself. But it was never about erasing guilt, it was about forcing others to feel it. Bramwell, Beatrice Halberd, even Wenley, they each played the role Foch cast for them. The lights flickered. From the corridor came the sound of a door creaking open. Holmes turned, drawing his revolver. He's here. But it wasn't Foch. It was a man in surgical scrubs, hands trembling. I was told to wait, he stammered. He paid me to maintain the equipment, said it was for research. I didn't know. Holmes approached calmly. Where is he? I don't know, the man whispered. He said once this last phase began, he'd disappear for good, said. The final act didn't need an audience. Holmes turned to Watson, his face hardening. He's closing the theatre. But even as the words left his mouth, another detail struck him, a tiny, absurd inconsistency. On the chalkboard, amid diagrams and scrawled notes, one phrase repeated, Nullimer's sign cause no death without cause. He left it for us, Holmes said, not as a clue, as a signature. He looked around the room again. Every angle had been staged with precision, every prop arranged with theatrical care. Which means he's not done, Holmes murmured. One final scene remains, and as thunder cracked outside, somewhere in the decaying walls of Eastmore Asylum, the true endgame stirred, its shape just beginning to take form. Holmes stood silently in the chamber, the phrase Nullimer's sign causa echoing in his thoughts. Behind him, the hum of outdated machinery and Bramwell's soft, drugged breaths seemed to underscore the emptiness Foch had left in his wake. But it wasn't over, not yet. Holmes's gaze swept the room again, not for evidence now, but for meaning. He never meant to disappear completely, he said at last, turning to Watson and Lestrade. Foch wants to be understood, not as a villain, but as something righteous. Watson raised a brow. Righteous, Holmes nodded. These murders weren't revenge in the crude sense. He didn't kill Bramwell. He preserved him, put him on display, drugged, monitored, like a prized specimen. No bloodlust, no haste. Control. Lestrade crossed his arms. Then what was the motive? Power? No. Holmes said, his voice low. Obsession. He walked back to the chalkboard, staring at the Latin phrase. Foch wasn't just recreating failure, he was rewriting history. Not to cover his disgrace, but to correct a narrative. One he believes the world got wrong. He pointed to Jane Halberd's photo. She wasn't just a patient. She was the moment the world stopped listening to him. The moment Gideon Bramwell stepped forward and shifted blame. Foch lost more than his career, he lost control over truth. Watson's voice dropped. He wants to be believed. Exactly. Holmes replied, these murders are stories' lessons, each crime mirroring Eastmore's disgrace, each suspect cast in the roles he blames for his ruin. He turned real people into metaphors for betrayal. He turned to the technician still huddled near the door. "When did he last come here?" "2 nights ago," the man stammered. He said the final phase was ready, said the truth would be heard, loud and clear. Holmes's brow furrowed. Theatre. That's how he sees this, which means his last scene must be public. He strode out of the chamber, Watson and Lestrade close behind. Back at Baker Street, Holmes plunged into his files, shuffling through. News clippings, photographs, timelines. The rhythm of Fox's mind was in there somewhere coiled within symbols, timing, phrases. And then, at the bottom of a stack, he found it. A press release. Upcoming medical ethics conference. 3 days away. Venue, the Halberd Institute for Medical Research. Of course, Holmes breathed. He's bringing the play to its climax. At the very altar that bears her name. Watson read over his shoulder. Beatrice Halberd is keynote speaker. Holmes's expression turned grim. The sister of the girl who died at Eastmore. The woman Falk deems most guilty of distorting the truth. She funded investigations. Rallied protest painted him a monster. Lestrade straightened. He means to kill her. No, Holmes said sharply. That's too simple. He means to dismantle her. They arrived at the Halberd Institute the following morning. Security had already been tightened after Holmes's warning. Inside, final preparations for the conference were underway. Technicians wheeled projection equipment through polished halls, and physicians rehearsed speeches over coffee. Holmes barely noticed them. His eyes followed wires, scanned lights, studied angles. He circled the stage, approached the lighting booth, checked beneath podiums and behind curtains. And then he saw it. A black case wired into the AV system out of place. Too old, heavy. "Watson," he called, kneeling. "Help me." They pried the box open. Inside was not a bomb, but a reel-to-reel film projector. Loaded, powered, and rigged to play automatically at the opening of the keynote address. Holmes examined the film strip. A frame caught the light grainy footage of Jane Halberd on a gurney, her eyes wide and still. Overlaid was text, "She died forgotten. Until now." Watson looked pale. He was going to broadcast it. "Not just that," Holmes said. "He's making his case. This is his courtroom." They disconnected the machine, rendering it inert. But Holmes's expression didn't relax. "Where is he now?" They searched the building for over an hour, but Falk had already been there and gone. In one of the Institute's storage rooms, they found a torn page from an old case report, Eastmore's final audit. Scribbled across it in ink, "You silenced me. Now I speak for the dead." Holmes stared at it, then slowly folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. That evening, back at Baker Street, Watson found him at the fire, eyes vacant. He never wanted to disappear, Holmes said quietly. He wanted to exist forever through fear, through myth. Falk believes he's a martyr. Every murder was a sermon, every clue an invitation to understand. Watson sank into the chair opposite, and now, Holmes exhaled. Now he has nothing left to prove. which makes him truly dangerous. But why go so far? Watson asked. Why build this theatre of death just to make a point? Holmes looked up, something haunted in his gaze. Because, my dear Watson, for Fogg, belief is everything. In his mind, the world betrayed reason. The institutions that scorned him, the people who ignored him, they didn't just cost him his reputation, they declared him mad. He paused, then added, and so he decided to become the very spectre they feared, a ghost haunting their science, proving in death what he never could in life. Watson was silent for a long while. Then, softly, "Do you believe he'll strike again?" Holmes turned back to the fire. "Yes," he said, "because no theatre ends without a curtain call." Holmes slept little that night. Dawn was no more than a pale promise when he roused Watson. "The curtain falls today," he said, folding the extra handgun into his coat pocket. "Fogg will attempt one last performance. And it won't be on stage." Watson nodded, voice firm. "We're ready." They arrived at Baker Street as Lestrade awaited, flanked by uniformed officers. Holmes laid out their plan: conceal Bramwell's presence within the flat, disguised and sedated enough to appear unconscious, while every entrance and exit was carefully monitored. The flat would be bait, a stage set for Fogg to enter and deliver his final act of redemption or revenge. By mid-morning, Bramwell, once revived, lay on the sofa, expression blank under the sedative's effect but safe. Holmes had personally instructed the chemist on a slow-release cocktail to keep him compliant and alive. Every other room was sealed, every call line tapped, every window watched. Holmes and Watson took their positions near the door, Lestrade just behind. Hours passed with only the ticking clock for company. Then, precisely at 11:47 a.m., the front door clicked, not with a key, but with a card swipe. Holmes's heartbeat quickened. He exchanged a glance with Watson. In the doorway stood the man himself, Lucien Fogg, immaculate in dark suit, hands ungloved but steady. His face was pale, eyes glinting with cold defiance. A briefcase hung at his side. Holmes stepped forward. "You're punctual, Mr. Fogg." Fogg's voice was soft. "I prefer to keep to schedule." He glanced at Bramwell. "You kept him safe." Holmes held his gaze unwavering. "He's safer than you'll ever be today." Fogg's expression flickered. He set the briefcase on the rug and opened it. Inside, fresh medical notes, psychological profiles of Holmes and Watson, and a scalpel. Blade gleaming, Lestrade moved a step closer. Holmes raised a gloved hand. "Stand down." Fogg didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, thin and hollow. "You know me, Holmes. I need an audience. A confession." Bramwell restored. "My narrative complete. To speak of Jane Halberd's death? Of your shame at Eastmoor?" Holmes asked. "Or is this another sermon?" Fogg closed the briefcase. "I came to make you watch, to prove the truth is mine." He advanced, scalpel raised. Lestrade cautioned, hands wary. But Holmes interrupted. "No, let him speak." Fogg paused, eyes moving from Bramwell's pale face to Holmes. "I am not the monster they said," he began. "I was brilliant, but brilliance terrifies others. And when Jane died d'accident, it was not my fault. I begged them to reconsider, to wait. They condemned me anyway. He looked at the scalpel. I came prepared to stage another tragedy. But Bramwell, you saved him. You deconstructed my mythology, and now must destroy him. Holmes's voice was low, measured. You're delusional. This isn't truth, it's self-aggrandizement. Fox. Lips trembled. No, everything I've done was measured, designed to reveal their hypocrisy. He took a breath, then turned toward the sofa. But this ends now. With lightning speed, he lunged. Blade aimed at Bramwell. Holmes reacted instantly, springing forward. Ankle catching the blade mid-slice, a shot rang out. Lestrade's revolver barked. Fox staggered, scalpel clattering. In the same moment, Holmes struck the briefcase with his elbow. Dr. Bramwell stirred, eyes flickering open. Watson dove in, cuffing Fox as he collapsed. Peers of constables rushing in. Holmes knelt beside Bramwell. The surgeon gazed up with confusion before recognition dawned. Holmes. Watson. Holmes gave a curt nod. Speak only when ready. Bramwell closed his eyes again. Breathing easier, Lestrade hovered over Fox, who lay still, the scalpel inches away. He's wounded, Holmes observed, but not mortally. The bullet grazed the arm. It spared him for now. Fox's breath rattled. He looked at Holmes, anger and triumph swirling in his eyes. I hoped you'd understand. Holmes straightened. I understood enough. The narrative never belonged to you, it belonged to truth. Fox closed his eyes. The fight leaving him, Lestrade knelt to search for the film reel from the Institute. Projected despite his wound, Fox had forgotten to retrieve it. The reel lay amid the briefcase contents and was surrendered to Lestrade. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds unexpected, almost defiantly hopeful. Holmes signaled to Watson. Come. On the front steps, he paused to let Bramwell be assisted from the flat. The surgeon stood, supported by Watson and Holmes. His face was drawn, but his eyes were clear. Lestrade guided Fox into a waiting carriage. The villain's red-stained arm was bound with care, and he looked over at Holmes, expression broken. You denied me the performance, he whispered, but the audience will still remember. Holmes inclined his head. Let them, he said quietly, but memory is no substitute for fact. Bramwell coughed, voice hoarse, the narrative. Yes. Holmes looked at them, battered but unbowed. Then let us write the final chapter. The evidence, the film, the notes. Fox's confession would be recorded and published. The pattern revealed, the motive laid bare. The theater closed, the script ended, and the shadow receded at last. But as Holmes watched Bramwell escorted away, Falluc's last words echoed faintly in his mind. The killer's indictment of truth over narrative was a danger undimmed, and in that the detective knew the final act would always require vigilance even after the curtain falls. Dusk settled over Baker Street as Holmes, Watson, Bramwell, and Lestrade gathered in the half-lit sitting room. Bramwell, though pale and wary, had recovered enough to speak again. Files lay strewn across the table. Fox's confession, the recovered film reel, and records from the Halberd Institute. It seemed the case was finally drawing to a close. Holmes looked at the closed doors, then at Lestrade. Secure all documents and ensure Fox's assertions are thoroughly recorded. The public must know the full measure of his actions and motives. Lestrade nodded. It will be done. Watson released a breath. Is it over, Holmes? Holmes's expression darkened. Fox is captured, but capture seldom speaks truth in full. His narrative that revenge for Eastmore drove him fits. But his psychology, as twisted as it is, doesn't account for everything. He paused, eyes flicking to Bramwell, who remained silent, attentive. Holmes stepped forward. Dr. Bramwell, you were present at the Halberd Institute when Fox's projector was found. Did you notice anything odd about the AV setup? The power feeds, perhaps? Bramwell frowned, recalling. Now that you mention it, the projector seemed connected to the Institute's main generator. Yet it was placed in a secured cabinet not normally powered. I assumed it was temporary wiring. Holmes stared at him. Exactly. But someone else with technical access must have rigged it. Bramwell's mouth twitched. Dr. Chen handled the AV systems last week for a symposium test. Holmes froze, then smoothed his features. Thank you. Moments later, Holmes leaned close to Lestrade. Chen was present at nearly every crime scene operating theater. Whopping clinic equipment orders. The cyanide murder. He never lied, but neither did he protest. Why? Lestrade's face flickered with realization. His neutrality now seems suspicious. Holmes nodded. Neutrality perfect camouflage. Watch Chen carefully. He may hold the final piece of this twisted design. Lestrade departed to magnetize hospital logs and interview staff on Chen's whereabouts. Holmes motioned Bramwell and Watson closer. He looked at Bramwell. Your lectures in Berlin, did Dr. Chen ever assist officiating them? Bramwell thought. Yes, he shadowed me during demonstrations. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Yet he was not trained in West German medical AV protocol. For him to rig the projector, he needed someone's endorsement, someone with institutional control. Watson raised an eyebrow. Price? Holmes shook his head. No, Price lacked access. But Chen, managing anesthetist, oversaw technical staff. He could authorize electrical feed to secured rooms. He turned back to Bramwell. Did Chen ever show particular interest in German Siemens wiring during your demonstration? Bramwell hesitated. He asked about its safety, about potential feedback. But I dismissed it as curiosity. Holmes closed his eyes. Feedback. Code word. He opened them abruptly. Price and Halberd crafted the theatrical deception. Fox executed the plot to control the narrative. But Chen, he was the orchestrator. He ensured each scene occurred. He switched the cyanide syringe, tampered with ventilation orders for Wapping to conceal Bramwell's location, and ensured the projector played publicly. He choreographed the death and resurrection. The spectacle. Bramwell's face registered. Shock. Chen. But he's a quiet, composed, Holmes confirmed. The ideal stage manager. Unseen. Indispensable, yet present. Watson took a breath. But why? What does he gain? Holmes stepped to the window. the dying light reflecting off his pince-nez, control, legacy. Chen felt overlooked always in Bramwell's shadow since Berlin. Each crime elevated him behind the scenes, shaping the narrative but ceding the spotlight. Falk wielded the blade, Halberd faked the trail, Price and Little enabled deception. But Chen controlled timing, optics, and the final reveal. Holmes turned sharply. Time to confront him. They found Dr. Chen in the hospital AV control room, eyes glued to monitoring screens long after the systems were shut down. Holmes and Lestrade entered quietly. Watson stayed outside. Holmes's voice cut through the hum. Dr. Chen. Chen didn't start. He lowered his gaze slowly. I thought you'd never know. Lestrade stepped up. Chen, this ends now. We know your role. Chen's shoulders tightened. He spoke steadily. I did what was necessary. Bramwell had to vanish for the greater good. Falk was going to destroy everything with emotion. Halberd, Price, Little they were too sentimental. I ensured it remained controlled. Professional. Holmes's eyes glinted. Controlled. You nearly let Falk murder Bramwell in Baker Street. You poisoned Holmes. You manipulated tragedies. Chen nodded reluctantly. Everything was meant to reach the same end. Bramwell hidden. Fox. Narrative smothered. The world spared a public spectacle of scandal. Lestrade advanced. But you set the spectacle in motion yourself. Chen looked drained. They needed me, but not to stop them, to keep them in line. Without me, Falk might have spiraled further. Without me, Halberd might have leaked. Without me, the narrative shattered. Holmes stepped closer. Then we ask, who were you serving? Institution? Justice? Yourself? Chen's lip quivered. All of the above. I couldn't let chaos rule science. And there it was, the final layer. Moral justification tangled with ambition and fear. Not revenge. Not mere control, but preservation of order at any cost. Holmes sighed. Your final deception was playing God. Outside, Watson joined them. Holmes glanced at Lestrade. Arrest him both for conspiracy and attempted murder. Lestrade did. Watson put a hand on Holmes's shoulder. Holmes closed his eyes. Sometimes, Holmes said softly, the villain isn't the one we see with the blade, but the one pulling the strings. Convinced the play must go on. He opened his eyes again, expression weary. Case closed. But let the record show that truth isn't always loud. Often, it's whispered by the invisible. And with that, the tangled narrative was finally unraveled, leaving the audience London and beyond with a story darker, subtler, and infinitely more human than any Falk or Chen ever dreamed possible. The rain came softly that morning, washing Baker Street in a muted silver, as if London itself were exhaling after weeks of breathless tension. Holmes stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the passers-by through streaked glass. Below, a police carriage waited to transport Dr. Elias Chen to remand, his expression unreadable behind the frost-rimmed panes of the Scotland Yard coach. Inside, Lestrade gathered his notes while Watson finished pouring tea. Bramwell sat close to the fire, still pale, his thoughts distant, the weight of his resurrection not yet settled on his shoulders. The silence, though restful, was not peaceful. Holmes spoke without turning. It is a rare occasion, Watson, when we corner the truth and feel no triumph. Watson stirred. The truth was all we wanted, Holmes. And we have it now. Holmes slowly turned. Do we? Fock is behind bars. Halbert has been stripped of his license. Price and Little are disgraced. And now Chen, the silent engineer of chaos, faces his reckoning. Yet, Bramwell looked up. Yet what? Holmes approached the hearth and knelt, lifting a thin stack of correspondence. 3 days ago, a telegram arrived from Baden-Baden. It mentioned a Dr. Elias Chen requesting sanctuary at a private clinic, signed with his exact middle initial, Watson's. Brow furrowed. Impossible. Chen was arrested. Holmes unfolded a second sheet, and yesterday, Lestrade sent me this. It contains the medical examiner's report of the man held at Scotland Yard. The man in custody is indeed named Elias Chen, but he is not our Chen, a twin, a cousin, or a ringer trained to mimic. Either way, the real orchestrator is gone. A stunned silence filled the room. Lestrade rose abruptly. He escaped. Holmes nodded grimly. Before we ever cornered him, I believe he planned the possibility of capture. A body double, perhaps a retired hospital orderly, with slight resemblance brought in at the last hour. The real Chen disappeared from the Halbert Institute the night before his arrest. It was all staged. Our triumph, Watson, was also his final deception. Watson's cup rattled on its saucer. But then, we've nothing. Holmes's eyes glinted faintly. Not quite. He left in haste, and he made an error. He moved to the desk and pulled from beneath a stack of files a single, scorched fragment of an old Eastmore patient record, filed under a name long erased. Felton, but listed as guardian. Dr. E. C. Bramwell stood slowly. Eastmore. Holmes nodded. Chen was not merely a physician there. He was Fock's guardian. They were linked long before any of this began. He recruited Fock as a weapon years ago. Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. So Fock wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn. All this time, Holmes took his seat. Yes, Chen raised him in that asylum, fed him stories, groomed his resentment into purpose. When the time came, he unleashed Fock under the pretense of personal vengeance, allowing himself to remain in the shadows. Watson's voice was soft, and we played into his hands. Holmes tapped the desk. Not entirely. The world knows the crimes. The patients of Halbert are safe. Bramwell's name is restored. And we still have Chen's trail. He fled. Yes, but no man leaves without trace. Eventually, he'll emerge again. Men like him always do. Outside, the carriage rolled away with the imposter Chen. A necessary decoy, a small lie to buy time. Holmes stood, brushing coal dust from his fingers. There is a comfort, perhaps, in believing justice is final. But justice, like truth, is a pursuit, rarely a destination. Bramwell walked toward the door. And what of me? My reputation, my future? Holmes looked at him kindly. You were the bait, doctor, and nearly the sacrifice. But now you are the survivor. Use that wisely. As Bramwell left, Lestrade rose. "So what do we tell the press?" Holmes smirked faintly. "That Scotland Yard has cracked the most sophisticated conspiracy London has seen in a decade. Leave out the escape. Let the city rest." Watson watched Holmes carefully. "You'll hunt him, won't you?" Holmes's gaze turned back to the rain. "I already am." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with possibility of unfinished justice, of a criminal mind still lurking in the folds of the world, and of the great detective who, once again, found victory wrapped in ambiguity. Not every ending offered closure, but it always offered clarity, and somewhere. Elias Chen moved again under a new name, unaware that Sherlock Holmes had already begun stitching together the faint, forgotten threads he had left behind. The fog was rolling in from the Thames by the time Holmes and Watson stepped outside, the lamplight catching in its folds like secrets wrapped in silk. Behind them, 221B Baker Street faded into the mist, a quiet backdrop to a city whose heart had briefly stopped and begun to beat again. The case of the vanishing tailor and the man who sewed his own alibi had been publicly resolved. Newspapers sang their praises, and Scotland Yard basked in unearned glory. But for Holmes, the melody was off-key. They walked in silence for a time, boots clicking against wet stone, until Watson asked, "Do you think he's watching us now?" Holmes didn't answer at once. His gaze lingered on a shadow that moved just beyond a wrought-iron gate. A cat, perhaps, or not. He's many things, Watson. But a man without patience is not one of them. If he watches, he'll do so from far away, and long after we've ceased to expect it. Watson exhaled into his scarf. "You speak as if it's unfinished, because it is," Holmes replied softly. The deception was elaborate, precise, but one thread still dangles. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded square of deep red silk, the same fabric found in Bramwell's old workshop, thought to be unrelated. Holmes held it up beneath a street lamp. Embroidered on one corner, nearly invisible, were initials, AC in tiny cross-stitched letters. Watson blinked. Chen's monogram. Holmes nodded. Hidden inside a lining meant never to be seen. Not part of Bramwell's collection. A plant, perhaps, or a signature, a final stroke of the needle. But why leave it? Holmes turned the square over and pointed to a nearly imperceptible ridge under the stitching. With care, he pulled at it, revealing a hidden fold. Inside, a note barely larger than a postage stamp had been sewn into the hem. Holmes unfolded it, lips tightening as he read aloud. "The pattern never ends, Mr. Holmes. Threads fray, and some are cut, but the weave goes on. Find me again if you can." Holmes said nothing more. He handed Watson the note and began walking again. The rhythm of his stride had changed, slower, more deliberate. Watson caught up, slipping the paper into his pocket. "So he's challenging you?" "No," Holmes murmured. "He's inviting me." They turned down a quiet alley where the gaslights flickered low. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour. A few streets away, life resumed. Carts rolled over cobblestones. A child laughed. The world believed its danger was past. But the detective knew better. He paused at a newsstand and bought a copy of the Times. The front page bore his own likeness and the headline, "Holmes Unravels. The Alibi, Taylor's Murder Web Exposed," beneath it. A brief column mentioned the recovery of 3 more bodies near the old Eastmont Asylum grounds lawn. G. buried, recently unearthed. Fox early victims, no doubt. Another column detailed the resignation of Chief Inspector Halberd from the Board of Medical Ethics, a neat package. A bow on top. Yet Holmes read each word with growing detachment. When they reached the door of a quiet cafe, he stopped. Inside, warm yellow light glowed. The world of ordinary people, soup and bread, conversation, laughter beckoned. But Holmes didn't enter. Instead, he looked upward toward a window with no light behind it, and said, "He's not done. Not with me. Not with London." Watson rested a hand on his shoulder. "And what will you do?" Holmes turned toward him, eyes sharp, with something far colder than resolve. "Wait. Listen. Watch. He'll resurface. Men like him always return to their own handiwork." Watson gave a short nod, understanding without needing more. He had seen it before. The mind already slipping into the next maze, the hunt quietly, beginning again before the last had even ended. They parted then, Holmes vanishing into the night fog, Watson turning toward the cafe. A warm place for now. A pause in the storm. And far away. Across the channel perhaps, or buried under a new identity somewhere in London. A man with delicate fingers and a fondness for fabric dipped his pen once more into ink and began to draft. A new pattern. One that would be subtle, devastating, perfectly stitched. Because, as Holmes had said, and Chen had echoed, the weave goes on.